Hi, everyone, welcome to Style 3D channel. In this video you will learn the technique behind washed denim jeans creation. 1. Handling denim scanning and repeating patterns. Start by scanning well-ironed denim jeans. Scan the following components. 1. Main textures on both sides. 2. Top stitching and waistband. 3. Structural elements like pockets and plackets. 4. Front pattern for segment scanning. Use stickers for marking during scanning. 5. Back pattern for segment scanning. The number of segments depends on the scanning area. 6. Washed edges on the outer side of the legs. Note, the specific scanning content depends on the actual item. For important structures and details, it's recommended to scan them for reference. Next, let's proceed with handling the texture map. Open the front-facing scan texture in Photoshop. To avoid damaging the original image, it's best to work on a duplicated layer. Check the size of the pattern, which is approximately 4,000 pixels in both width and height. In the menu bar, navigate to Filter, Other, and find the Offset tool. Set the Offset tool to move half the distance horizontally and vertically, approximately 2,000 pixels. This way, the seam will be displayed in the middle, making it easier for us to handle. There are various methods for handling seams, and here we'll use the Clone Stamp tool in Photoshop. Select the Clone Stamp tool in Photoshop. Adjust the tool to an appropriate size. Near the seam, find an area with a similar color. Hold down the Alt key, and click the left mouse button to sample the pattern from that area. Move to the seam area, hold down the Shift key, and click and drag the left mouse button downward to cover the seam. The horizontal seams can be handled in the same way. This completes the processing of the main front-facing texture map. Export it as a JPG or PNG file format. Due to the thickness of the fabric, we can observe that the sides of the fabric appear lighter in color on the actual item. Therefore, we need to create a texture map for the sides of the fabric. Duplicate the recently processed main front-facing texture map. Choose the Dodge tool. Adjust the brush size to the maximum and reduce the exposure. This way, the dodging effect will be softer and easier to control. Apply the Dodge tool on this layer until the color lightens to an appropriate level. Save the completed side texture map as a JPG or PNG file. Next, let's use another method to process the scan texture map for the back side. For handling seams, we can use the Fill tool. Use a dashed line to select the seam area. In the Edit menu, find the Fill tool. Choose Content Aware and click OK. Wait for a moment, and the seam will be filled. Use the same method to handle the horizontal seams. Finally, export the completed back-facing texture map as a JPG or PNG file. Next, let's process the texture map for the single-line top stitching. Open the Scan Texture Map in Photoshop. This pattern is intended to be applied as top stitching to the garment, so we only need the left and right sides of the pattern to seamlessly connect. Drag out a reference line using the ruler. If you don't have the ruler visible, you can enable it under the View menu. Use the shortcut Ctrl+T to bring up the layer editing box. Rotate the layer so that the edges of the top stitching are in a horizontal position. Press Enter to confirm. Then, using the method mentioned earlier, move the left and right seams to the middle position. Set the horizontal displacement value, keeping the vertical value at 0. Use the clone stamp tool to complete the middle seam and fill in any other blank areas. Finally, use the crop tool to cut the pattern to the appropriate area. Ensure that the upper edge aligns with the stone-washed white edge, and leave a portion of the texture at the bottom. This completes the creation of the seamlessly repeating single-line top-stitching texture map. Finally, export the file as either JPG or PNG format. Next, let's process the texture map for double-line top-stitching. The operation method is the same as for single-line top-stitching, so we won't repeat the instructions here. Finally, export the processed texture map as either JPG or PNG format. Next, let's process the repeating pattern for the waistband. The steps are the same as before. For curved edges, you can use the liquefy tool under the filter menu to straighten the edges. Then, use displacement to move the left and right seams to the middle, complete the seams as mentioned earlier, and crop the pattern to the appropriate area. Ensure that the upper and lower edges align with the edges of the waistband. To avoid issues during the subsequent application of the texture map, use the clone stamp tool to fill in the upper and lower edges completely. Finally, save the completed waistband pattern as either JPG or PNG format. 2 Stitching and texture creation for scan textures. When creating denim texture maps like this, you need to export 2D panel snapshots from the studio. Open the completed denim pants white model project. First, arrange all the panels neatly in the 2D viewport. Once arranged, avoid moving the panel positions in the 2D viewport to prevent constant adjustments during texture map creation. Select all the patterns and hide them using the shortcut Shift+Q. Then, select the front and back patterns of the left leg and show them using Shift+Q. Now, go to the toolbar, select 2D Pattern Snapshot, and in the pop-up window, ensure the option Do Not Export Hidden Patterns is checked. Set the resolution to 300 for clearer textures. Only select Sewing Line, Internal Line, and Fabric Texture, then click Save to output the 2D pattern snapshot. Repeat the same process for other patterns. Next, open the exported patterns in Photoshop. Import the scanned texture images and arrange them in order. Select all 6 layers, right-click, and choose Rasterize Layer to facilitate future layer editing. Right-click again and create a clipping mask, restricting the texture within the pattern's boundaries. Then, while holding down the Control key, press the T key to transform all 6 layers simultaneously. This allows you to perform operations such as scaling on all 6 layers together. To make the denim texture in the 3D effect more prominent, you can slightly enlarge the texture layer. Take note of the scaling value, as you can use the same scale when creating the back pattern texture. Adjust the position of the scan texture based on the reference image of the actual garment. When combining and placing textures, pay attention to the following points. 1. Align the position of the folds as closely as possible with the actual garment. 2. Ensure a natural transition at the top and bottom joints of the texture, avoiding significant color differences. 3. Maintain a vertical direction for the texture to ensure a natural flow. After the general assembly, let's start by handling the faded white part at the hem. Find the scan layer for the hem, press Ctrl+J to duplicate the layer. Delete everything except the hem. Adjust the size and position of the hem to align the faded white effect on the left side of the pants with the edge of the pattern. Then, use the liquefy tool to straighten the stitching lines at the hem until the texture is in an appropriate size and position. Next, let's handle the faded part at the edge of the front pocket. Select this layer, press Ctrl+J to duplicate it, then use the lasso tool to cut out the texture at the edge of the pocket. Place the new layer within the clipping mask, use the warp tool to adjust this edge to a suitable position, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the pattern. Erase any excess content using the eraser tool. Then, select all the layers within the mask, right-click, and choose Merge Layers. Next, you need to clean up any unwanted markings, structures, and seams between the layers. Use the Clone Stamp tool to pick up nearby textures and cover up the marks or seams. Use the liquefy tool to adjust the wrinkles a bit because when the pants are worn on the model, they might stretch and deform the wrinkles. Use the lasso tool to delete any excess textures. At this point, the texture for the front pattern is complete. Next, assemble the texture for the back pattern, following a similar process to the front pattern. If there are small areas missing texture, you can copy and paste from other regions. Once everything is processed, merge all the layers for the back pattern. At this point, the texture for the left leg of the jeans is complete. Save it in PSD file format. Due to the color deviation between the physical object and the scan texture, we need to color correct the texture. Here, I'll introduce 4 commonly used color correction tools, and you can choose the one that suits your needs. Navigate to the Layer Tool menu in the bottom right corner and choose Levels. Adjust the parameters and the properties to observe color changes and make the texture's light-dark relationship more apparent. Next, open the Curves tool, typically creating a slight S-shaped curve. Move on to the Hue/Saturation tool to fine-tune colors, adjusting overall tones to match the physical object. Then, use the Brightness/Contrast tool to enhance texture brightness and contrast. Finally, select all 4 color correction layers and place them in a group. Please note that you don't necessarily have to use all 4 color adjustment tools mentioned above. The goal is to adjust the texture's color to resemble the real object. With this, the process of scanning texture stitching and color adjustment is complete. 3 techniques to enhance washed denim effects. Due to the extensive coverage of top stitching, it can be challenging to use a segment-by-segment stitching method. Therefore, we can first create the top stitching in Style 3D and then export it to add to the pattern texture. Open the Jeans project file and add a new top stitching material. Then, drag and drop the previously processed single-line top stitching texture onto the top stitching texture slot. Next, add the single-line top stitching to the corresponding positions. Adjust the values and properties of the top stitching according to the situation and enable the margin blend option. Create another top stitching. Following the method used for the single-line top stitching, add the double-line top stitching texture to the correct positions. It's important to note that double-line top stitching is not needed on the inner side of the right leg. Next, export all the top stitching on the left leg pattern separately. Display only the left leg pattern. Go to the 2D pattern snapshot in the Tools menu. Set the resolution to 300 and check only the top stitching, leaving the rest of the elements unchecked. Then go back to the previously created left leg pattern texture and drag the exported top stitching texture into Photoshop. You may notice that the direction of the top stitching is incorrect, so I went back to the previous file, rotated the layer, and re-exported the texture. Repeat the previous steps and re-export the top stitching texture. Import the corrected top stitching texture into Photoshop and create a clipping mask. You will notice that there are noticeable seams between the top stitching and the base texture. You can use the eraser tool to remove the traces at the edge junction. Adjust the eraser size and flow to carefully erase the seams and strive for a seamless blend at the junction. This way, the imported top stitching is completed. Here, we need to remove the back pocket using a tool. First, select the area of the pocket, then go to Edit and choose the Fill tool. In the Content-Aware mode, click OK, and after a moment, the pocket will be removed. If the removal is not clean, you can repeat the filling action or use the Stamp tool to cover any remaining details. Next, we need to create the faded edges detail on the outer side of the leg. Import 3 scanned photos of the edge details and arrange them in order. Then, use the polygonal lasso tool to select the corresponding areas. Press Ctrl+J to copy the selected area onto a new layer. Move the copied layer to the appropriate position. Use the clone stamp tool to fill in any blank areas. Finally, use the eraser tool to blend the edges with the base texture. Continuing with the process, select a section of the edge with top stitching, press Ctrl+J to copy the selection to a new layer. Move the new layer to the corresponding area on the pattern, then drag this layer into the middle of the clipping mask. Use the transform tool to smooth and shape the edge, and adjust the position with the liquify tool. If the double stitching doesn't align, you can use the liquify tool again. Alternatively, select the corresponding area with the lasso tool, switch to the move tool, hold the Alt key, and click drag to duplicate a layer. Use the clone stamp tool and eraser tool to blend the edge with the base texture. Repeat the same process for the faded edge below. Finally, merge all the layers created and use the clone stamp and eraser tools to refine the edge transitions. This completes the processing of the posterior edge. For the outer side of the front pattern, follow the same process as before. Now, let's focus on handling the details of edges and corners. The method is consistent for all these details. Obtain the scan texture details and paste them onto the pattern. Adjust the position of the texture using various tools. Then, use the eraser or clone stamp tool to refine the seam edges, ensuring better integration with the base texture. We create a new group as a backup and place the layers that haven't been merged into it. Then, we merge the remaining layers. Next, we need to create shadows and highlights for the texture. In denim pants, certain areas appear darker due to shading from overlap, while some parts appear lighter due to a pronounced washing effect. First, we hide the texture layers. In the exported 2D patterns, there are internal lines included. At the edges of pockets and other areas where the fabric overlaps, the color tends to be darker. To facilitate positioning, we need to duplicate the internal lines. In the menu bar, find the Select menu and choose the Color Range option. Sample the color of the internal lines, adjust the color tolerance value until the internal lines appear white, indicating that the selected color range includes the internal lines. Click OK. Then go to Select, Modify, Expand by 2 pixels. Change the foreground color to black. Create a new layer, and use the shortcut Alt+Delete to fill the color. This creates the internal lines used for positioning. We find the Burn tool. This step is best done with a graphics tablet, as it provides better control over intensity and direction compared to a mouse. Make sure to set the exposure to a very low value to avoid applying too much pressure. You can also adjust other parameters of the Burn tool for different effects. Use the pen to draw along the internal lines and pocket positions, gradually drawing multiple times. Refer to the details of the actual item, and you can also darken the texture color in the corners. A few gentle strokes with a larger brush can achieve this. Near the waist, shadows should also be enhanced. Next, we need to add highlights to the faded areas. Switch to the Dodge tool, which is used similarly to the Burn tool. Adjust the brush size and manually draw a whitening effect along the edges of the placket. Follow the principle of applying a little at a time. The fading effect at the knees and buttocks also needs enhancement. Create a new layer, select a rectangular area, and fill it with white. Use the Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur tool to completely blur the white rectangle. Adjust the size, position, and transparency as needed. Duplicate it and move one layer to the buttocks position. After achieving the desired effect, merge these 2 layers. Finally, let's add a fading effect to the outer edges. Use the Dodge tool with a small brush size and low exposure to gently draw the fading effect along the edges of the pattern. With this, the detailed enhancement of denim washing is complete. Save the file in PSD format. For texture creation for structures like pockets, zippers, and waistbands. First, export the 2D pattern of the back pocket. Copy the scanned texture of the back pocket. Right-click and create a clipping mask. Use the Warp tool to adjust the position of the pocket, aligning the edges of the pocket texture with the edges of the pattern as much as possible. Use the Clone Stamp tool to adjust the texture along the edges. Then, go to the previously created file for the left leg texture and copy the color adjustment layer group. This ensures consistency in the color of all texture maps. Similarly, we need to use the Burn tool and Dodge tool to adjust the light and shadow details of the pocket. Follow the original light and shadow relationships of the pocket, use the Burn tool in dark areas and the Dodge tool in light areas. Finally, save the completed back pocket texture map as a PSD file. The next step is to create the texture for the front pocket. Follow the same method as the back pocket, paste the scan texture onto the pattern, copy the color adjustment layer group, use the Burn and Dodge tools to handle the light and shadow effects, and finally save the file as a PSD format. The process for creating the fly-in crotch is the same as before, so no further explanation is provided. Since it's not possible to scan the entire texture for the waistband in one piece, follow the method used for creating top stitch. Create a new fabric material and add it to the waistband pattern. Then, add the processed waistband texture to the fabric's texture map. Adjust the size and position of the texture map. Display only the waistband pattern, go to the Tools menu, select 2D Pattern Snapshot, set the resolution to 300, and export a snapshot with only sewing lines and internal lines as a guide. Export another snapshot with only the texture map, adjusting the resolution to 300, without selecting sewing lines and internal lines, but only fabric texture. Then, export the file. Open the two exported texture maps. Copy the color correction layer group. Duplicate the texture layer. Switch to the Burn tool. The internal lines represent the sewing positions of the pants, so this area needs to have deeper shadows. Then switch to the Dodge tool to enhance the faded effect. Once done, save the file in PSD format. Next, you need to create the texture for the right leg. Similarly, import the 2D pattern for the right leg. Copy the texture map created for the left leg. Flip it horizontally and align the texture with the pattern. I won't go into the detailed alignment process here. Copy the highlight layer and flip it horizontally. I forgot to mention that you also need to adjust the position of the highlights. The difference in the texture map between the left and right leg patterns is that the right leg's inner side does not have top stitching or a fly. Therefore, we need to clean up these parts. Go back to the layers we created earlier, copy the corresponding sections, flip them horizontally, and overlay them in the correct positions. Use the clone stamp and eraser tools to make adjustments. Once adjustments are done, merge the layers. Next, use the dodge and burn tools to enhance the contrast. Save a completed texture map for the right leg as a PSD file. With this, all texture maps for the pants are now created. 5. Adding 3D textures and optimizing details. We will remove the previously added texture maps, top stitching, and other details, reverting to the initial white model state. Then, we can start adding the texture maps. Create a new material and then drag the PSD file of the left leg directly onto the texture map position. Open and use automatic normal map generation. Apply the material to the left leg's pattern and adjust its position to align with the pattern. Import other texture maps in the same way. Here, I noticed an issue with the waistband texture, so I went back and made some adjustments. Finally, let's take a look at the results after applying all the textures. After completing the texture mapping, we move on to the fabric properties. Uncheck the Use Same Material as Front option. Then, import the back texture map created in the first step. Check the option for using automatic normal mapping. Adjust the texture size and set the normal strength to an appropriate value. Next, go to the Materials side, Texture Properties and drag in the side texture map. Adjust the texture size and make sure to check the option for using automatic normal mapping. Now, add a texture map to the front of the fabric. Similarly, drag in the front texture map, adjust the texture size, and enable automatic normal mapping. At this point, all material texture maps are applied. Finally, we can enhance the visual effects by modifying the details of the model. First, increase the thickness of the pocket edges by adding a 0.1 cm internal line and sewing the stitching line to the internal line. This way, the side of the pocket will have thickness. You can use a similar method to modify other pocket areas. Additionally, enabling curved side geometry can make the edges look more three-dimensional. Lastly, turning on flat seam, one side, can add realism to the stitching line edges and allow adjustment of the direction of the single-sided seam. If you are not satisfied with the texture effect, you can directly make modifications in Photoshop. For example, if the top stitching at the hem is not aligned, go back to Photoshop to adjust the misaligned top stitching. After making the modifications, click Save. Return to the software interface, and a pop-up will appear asking if you want to update the changed texture. Click Yes, and you will see the 3D view automatically updating with the new texture. You can use the same method to adjust other issues. I won't go into details here. Great, let's take a look at the final result. That's it, guys, and I hope some of the tips will help your modeling work. If you like what we do, please liking, commenting and sharing this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in next video. Goodbye.